This is a computer rebuild that I'm going to do. I'm going to replace the keyboard here. It's been chipped and broken in many places. It's also missing a one keypad number. And I'm going to replace the top cover also. The top cover was about 25 bucks. The bottom one was about 35 bucks. I'm also going to be replacing it with from 8 gigabytes RAM to 16 gigabytes RAM. This computer has a chip right here on the top cover. Back side looks good, and on this side the SD card area looks good, although in the corner here around the power button it's completely broken away, exposing the power button and a big hole towards the top screen. And on the keypad, as I mentioned earlier, I'm also missing the right arrow button. I bought this computer for 200 bucks at a pawn shop about 4 years ago, and now it's time to refurbish it. Let's go. My trusty kit that I use for just about everything. First, let's take off the back panel. Must stay organized. You gotta keep track of your screws. Top panel, back panel. First, let's take out the battery. Line up your screws, make sure you keep them organized. Take out the RAM. I was gonna take out the hard drive. I was going to take out the fan, but I decided to take out the power module first. Alright, there it is, the NICS card, network interface card. That's for your Wi-Fi. Unplug the antenna wires. I had to mark where which wires went where, so I keep track. And I stopped. I'm going to take out the power button and the volume button next. Unplug it. Now take out the data board. This is one that it holds the SD card module and it holds an extra USB module. Now back to the cooling fan. Take the cooling fan out and unplug it. Time to take off the heatsink. The heatsink is a big copper tube that sits on top of the processor that's used to keep the processor cool. Time to meticulously remove the speaker wires and the speakers. Had to be very careful, these wires are thin. Disconnect the cables from the display monitor. And take the screws out for the top cover and display bracket area. Time to remove the top cover and display. Now we can get down to business. It's time to start figuring out how to take this motherboard off. What? I don't understand. Ah, hidden screw. Disconnect the power supply. There you go, one laptop motherboard. I had to compare the new keypad cover with the old one because it didn't come with a mouse pad. So it's time to take this mouse pad off. Lots of brackets. Off comes the mouse pad. Time to take a little beeper off. Every computer has a little beeper. And take out the power supply. Compare the two, make sure they match. Put the power supply back in. Put the little beeper back on with a little bit of super glue. And time to reinstall that mouse pad. Lots of cables here. As you'll notice later, I have a problem with the computer not wanting to start. See that cable, that white cable with the blue tip in the middle? Later on you'll watch me. I'll accidentally tuck it under the motherboard and not notice it. Which gives me a big headache at the end. Alright, finish reinstalling the mouse brackets. Checking the wiring. A couple more screws. Test it, seems to be good. Time to put the motherboard in. Watch that cable. It went right underneath the motherboard and I didn't even notice it. It looks like it's attached, but it's not. Time to install the speakers again. And carefully rewire that left speaker wires back through the case. These wires were really small, so I had to be careful not to pinch them. Then I needed to plug the speakers into the motherboard and check that cable check those speaker wires one more time. Plug in the power supply. Now every processor produces an extremely high amount of heat, and the way to get rid of that heat is through a paste that's called thermal paste. Every time you remove the heat sink, that big copper tube, from the processor, you should always, it's highly recommended to put a new blob of thermal paste on after you clean it. So I cleaned off the processor, new blob of thermal paste, and now I'm going to clean off the heat sink. Get rid of the old paste. That paste helps transfer the heat from the processor to that copper tubing for cooling. And if you get any kind of air gaps or bubbles between the two pieces, then it can cause a hot spot, which will cause lockups or the computer to fail. Crisscross your tightening patterns, make sure it tightens down even. Double check it, and time to install the cooling fan. Put the SD card and the USB daughter board back in. Plug in the cables. Put the power button and the volume button back on. And then plug those in along with the beeper. Check the wiring. Put the NIC card or network interface card back in. It's basically your Wi-Fi card. Time to install the hard drive back in. Now, time for some new RAM. I went from 8 gigabytes in the old system. Now I'm going to have 16 gigabytes of RAM. Put the battery back in, plug it in, and screw it down. Just about done. Okay, there we go. Now it's time to work on the top cover. Very carefully pry it off of the cover. It's usually just done with some snaps, plastic snaps. So be careful not to break those tabs, because then it doesn't want to reattach itself. So very carefully pull off the display unit. Pull your wires off from the hinges pull away the old. There we go, one display unit. All you gotta do now is just press it down and snap it back in. Looks good. Put your wires back into the hinges, and time to reattach the display module. Plugging the antenna wires back into the network interface card, because the wires run up through that top display cover, so when you open up to lift the display up, you're actually lifting up your Wi-Fi antenna at the same time, so that you get a good signal. Most Wi-Fi antennas go through your display, that way when you lift up the display, you're actually lifting up the antenna at the same time. Screw the brackets back in. And let's double check it. Stupid speaker keeps coming off. I have an issue. It's not starting up. Let's try unplugging the battery and putting the old RAM in. See what happens. Still doesn't start up. Something's not right. It's time to unplug it. Yep, nothing's working. Looks like I'm gonna have to tear it apart again. Luckily, when I pulled the battery off, I immediately saw that cable was underneath the motherboard and plugged it in. Let's do a double quick check. Make sure it starts up before I go any further. Yep, I've got a Dell emblem on the screen. We're good. Well, since that's taken care of, let's take out that old RAM and put that new RAM back in, since it wasn't the RAM. Plug the battery back in. Let's see if it starts up. Now, BIOS is saying, hey, your memory's not the same as it was, because we went from 8 gigabytes to 16 gigabytes of RAM now. It opens up. Checking the system to make sure I got 16 gigs of RAM instead of 8 gigs of RAM. Yes. Google's working. Netflix is working. Excel is working. Shut it down and finish putting it back together. Put the back cover on. Careful of them wires. And finish putting all them screws back in. Hopefully I don't have any left over. Perfect. Brand new refurbished laptop that I bought probably 5-6 years ago at the pawn shop for $200. Nice and pristine now. The sides are looking good. Back's looking good. Smooth, no chips. And if you look over here towards the power button, you can see that whole thing's been cleaned up. No more chips and cracks, especially on that corner. Front's looking good. And that big chunk that was taken out of the top is now no longer there. All nice and clean. And if you open it back up, you'll notice that right arrow button has been replaced, and I have a brand new keyboard. This laptop has served me well, and I like the fact that I can flip it over and use it as a tablet or as a laptop. So for about $55 I refurbished this old computer. Good job.